What's good, guys? Welcome back to another video. Today I want to really break down how much the Dolphins really did to protect their young quarterback. This is actually the third video of this sort of series where I already broke down the quarterback position in Tua Tagovailoa, and I already did break down the running back position with Chase Edmonds, Sony Michel, and Raheem Mostert and all of those guys. So if you want to check those out, they will be in the cards above me and will be in the description down below. So make sure you guys check that out as I do break down every position group going forward. So I'm really excited to get to the wide receivers and all of the defense. So if you want to check out the two videos I've already done of this series, please go check those out. If you're a fan of the Miami Dolphins and really want to know what they could be looking like heading into the next season, I really think you would be interested in those types of videos, so make sure you give them a watch. With that being said here, there's a lot to unpack with this offensive line group, so let's dive in. Before we get into the actual evaluation, I do want to say a couple of things about how I value the offensive line, because I do think it's similar to a lot of people who know football, but it might be different than a few people. But I heavily value the offensive line position, not just for the Miami Dolphins, but in football for any team. So I really want to jot down and give you guys a couple of notes of why I think this position is just so important. In terms of importance, I'm not going to rank the positions in terms of value, but shout out to the Veterans Minimum podcast and their host Nick Dace. If you want to check that out, I will also have their link in the description. But he always told me and always says in his podcast, which I completely agree with, the way to build the team is to get your quarterback and then go after the opponents and protect yours. So basically it's saying the trenches are the most important positions after the quarterback position, which I think is just so true. To me, it's so valuable because it protects what might be the most important position in all of sports, and an offensive line being good can help everyone around them being better. For example, an offensive line can make an average running back an 1,000-yard rusher, and they could do the same for the receivers, obviously giving the quarterback more time. I think it's one of the most valuable positions in all of football, which is why I am nervously excited to break down how the Miami Dolphins have addressed the position over the past few years and how it will look going into this year. Before we get into the offensive line as it is right now, as it's built right now, I do want to go back over the last 3 years. I think we'll start into his rookie season 2020, just because that's when we really reset the team. So everything kind of comes from there and they give a blueprint for what we are talking about now. So I think it's important that we go back and take a look at those offensive lines and the variations of those lines to see how we got from there to this current time where we have some new players, which we obviously need. What I mean by that is that in 2020, the Miami Dolphins had 3 rookie starters on their offensive line in Austin Jackson, Solomon Kindley, and Robert Hunt. Austin Jackson playing left tackle, Solomon Kindley playing right guard, and Robert Hunt playing right tackle, with Ted Karras at center and Eric Flowers rounding it all out at the left guard position. Austin Jackson was drafted 18th overall in the first round.
With the 18th pick in the 2020 NFL Draft, the Miami Dolphins select Austin Jackson, tackle, USC.
Robert Hunt was drafted 39th overall in the second round.
With the 39th pick in the 2020 NFL Draft, the Miami Dolphins select Robert Hunt, tackle, Louisiana Lafayette.
And Solomon Kindley was drafted 111th in the 4th round. Just to give you guys a picture of whereabouts they were drafted and the expectations upon them going in to their rookie year and for the rest of their NFL careers. So with that in mind, I do think it's important to say that Robert Hunt and Solomon Kindley were kind of drafted around where they were supposed to go, but Austin Jackson was definitely a little bit of a reach at pick 18, and the reason they actually did reach on him is that a run of tackles went in that draft, like Jedrick Wills, Andrew Thomas, and Tristan Wirfs. So I guess Chris Grier felt the need to take an offensive tackle at that 18th overall pick. There's also other factors involved, like the positional value of tackles and their value having to be in that first round. So Chris Grier definitely felt the pressure there, and he did reach on a raw but hopefully franchise left tackle in Austin Jackson. The tackle from USC is 6'5", 320 pounds, and he does have average arm length at 34 1/8 inches. The reason Austin Jackson was touted as this raw prospect, but with the potential to become a plus starter, was because of his athletic traits. We already went over his size, but man, the big man can move. He ran a 5.7 40-yard dash, and he did run a 7.953 cone drill at the NFL Combine in his draft year. And honestly, he looked a little bit faster on tape too. His athletic ability must have been so exciting for scouts and coaches during his college career and during the draft process, because they were probably thinking, just imagine what they could do with a guy who moves like that for his size. So yeah, you might be hearing this, you might be thinking, okay, so that's why they drafted him 18th overall, but the reason a lot of people think of it as a reach is because of his horrible technique. This is why some teams were put off him, is because he's such a talented player, but man, his technique was very, very flawed in college. His hand placement and footwork were almost non-existent and would be exploited at an NFL level when he's not just bigger than all the other players. It was really evident when he went against NFL caliber player in AJ Epinesa, who was drafted in the second round by the Bills, and he got dominated by him at the college level. So because of his technique, but with having those traits, he was touted as a low ceiling, high floor type of guy. He flashed his bend, how quickly he could pop up, and his ability to get to the second level. And wow, was I amazed when you could see his potential to be a monster in these screen passes, especially to wide receivers on the outside, just because of how fast he moves and how big he is. So imagine what he can do when he gets out there against defensive back. His kick slide, although it was lacking technique, was very quick, so a lot of people, including myself, thought he would be able to do well against those speed rushers. Evidently, that's not the case, but that was the thought of at that time going into the draft, is that he will be able to keep up with those speed rushers at the NFL level. We touched on his technique, and it being not good is an understatement. Man, his footwork was all over the place, and his hand placement was just never in the right spots, whether they were just hanging low or not being able to land his hands on the opposing defender. Another issue is that while he is big, he did lack some strength for his frame. So he lacked the strength to match his size, and that became incredibly evident at the NFL level with NFL caliber players coming at him. With all this in mind, scouts and coaches that did like him thought that his athleticism would be enough to make up for his lack of technique, at least until it caught up under their development teams. But really, that just hasn't happened yet. On the other hand, Robert Hunt has been easily the best offensive lineman the Miami Dolphins have drafted over the past 3 years. He also is 6'5" and 320 pounds like Austin Jackson, but he does have a tad shorter arms at 33.5 inches. Playing at Louisiana Lafayette, he was a good athlete, not as good as Austin Jackson, but a good enough athlete to play the guard or tackle position, and we saw that in the NFL. For him, his footwork and pad level were probably his worst traits coming out of college, but his combination of size, strength, and athleticism was impressive. He has an angry and hungry mentality when on the field, which is so important for offensive linemen because that is the basis of the job that they're doing. And the biggest reason he probably didn't go higher and a lot of teams were a little bit put off by him was probably his age, as he was a lot older than a lot of the other prospects. For example, they were drafted in the same draft, him and Austin Jackson, and he is 3 years older than Austin Jackson. Finally, Solomon Kindley was the last of the 3 starters to be drafted in that 2020 draft. From Georgia, Kindley is a massive human being at just 6'3", but 337 pounds. He blocked angry and nasty, which is obviously great for the position, and he fit well in a power gap scheme. His agility was great for his size, but not great in general, and the same could be said for his technique. He's a scrappy player who loves to duke it out and was a mauler, which you love to see, and to be honest, it wasn't a horrible selection at that point in the draft. Center Ted Karras was acquired from the New England Patriots as a solid veteran who can give you below average to average play.
And there goes another Patriots veteran. Offensive lineman Ted Karras is headed to the Miami Dolphins on a 1-year, $4 million contract. The 27-year-old Illinois product started 15 games at center in 2019 for the Pats, filling in for a sidelined David Andrews.
And is a good leader, which to be fair is probably very valuable on a team where we have so many young offensive linemen, especially with 3 of them starting. Left guard Ereck Flowers was acquired from Washington and was thought of to be a little bit of a reclamation project, but he actually did have a very solid year in 2019, so it was worth to take a shot on him as this team's starting left guard. In this year, the offensive line was pretty poor under offensive line coach Steve Marshall. Not nearly as bad as last year, which we'll get to, but still pretty bad. It was ranked in the bottom 5 of all NFL teams, but had stretches of average play, which for a young offensive line gave some confidence that they could do better going forward. So there was some promise if they could be coached up and developed correctly. Hunt actually played pretty good. He only allowed 3 sacks playing at that right tackle position, which we now know was out of position for him, so only giving up 3 sacks is not too bad, especially in a rookie year where you're playing out of position. Kindley was inconsistent and definitely struggled, which isn't uncommon for a rookie, especially one that's drafted in the later rounds. So when he flashed his upside, even though it was only a few times, it was an unexpected outcome, which is nice to see. So it did give a little bit of confidence that maybe he could be something in the NFL going forward, but most people still had him being kind of a swing guard going forward. Austin Jackson struggled the most out of all 3 rookies on that left side. As a raw prospect who a lot of people thought he probably shouldn't have even seen the field as early as he did, it was unfortunate to see how much out of his depth he was at the NFL level for a first round pick. Still, there were stretches of okay play, which I guess is all you could ask for a player like him being so raw coming out of the draft, but still nothing great to talk about. Ted Karras played okay for the position, only allowing 2 sacks, and I actually thought Ereck Flowers was pretty decent, but he did give up 5 sacks, which is a little bit unfortunate and not that great. It was a young young and inexperienced offensive line, and it really did show with its poor and inconsistent play, as they ranked 27th in pass protection and 23rd in run protection when it comes to pass block win rate and run block win rate respectively. With that being said, for an offensive line with 3 rookies and no elite offensive line talent beside them, it was kind of expected to be a development year for them. Heading into the next season with all the rookies heading into the second year, with already having 1 year of NFL experience under their belt and with some development, coaching, and progression, there was hope that we could see some improvements heading into the next year, but unfortunately that wasn't to be. Over the offseason, the Miami Dolphins made some questionable decisions and moves for such a pivotal time for the team and specifically for the offensive line. The first of which was hiring a new offensive line coach, Lemuel Jean-Pierre, a rookie first-time offensive line coach who was an offensive lineman himself, but his career didn't go as planned and he turned to coaching. And right from the beginning, it was a mysterious hire. Usually when you have a young offensive line, it's important to have a veteran offensive line coach who knows exactly what needs to be done to ensure that they develop the correct way, and if need be, can really put them through their paces if he needs to be stricter on them. It's particularly important, especially when you don't have an elite offensive lineman who's a veteran who can help them develop on the player side of things. So really, other than Lemuel Jean-Pierre, they didn't have a elite offensive lineman to look to help them coach them up. This was certainly the case when the most experienced guy on the entire offensive line was Jesse Davis, a career backup who, to be quite honest, was truly atrocious whenever he got the chance to see the field, so right from the beginning, it was a baffling hire. The only other real addition to the offensive line was Liam Eichenberg. Yes, we added guys like Austin Reiter and Greg Manx, but they're so unimportant that they're not even worth mentioning. Isaiah Wilson and Greg Little were added to the team, but they're already certified busts, and I actually hate using that term, especially prematurely, but in these two players' cases, it was definitely the truth, so they didn't provide any real help to the team. Two guys who are definitely worth mentioning who were on this team at the beginning of the year and weren't and ended up doing way better on the team after leaving the Dolphins was Jermaine Illuminor and Matt Skura. Those are two guys who were added during training camp but were cut shortly after. While it was kind of in a pinch due to injury, Jermaine Illuminor actually started 3 games for the Raiders and allowed 0 sacks. I know it's not much, and in the grand scheme of things he's not a starter, but man, he could have been very useful on this Dolphins team. Same goes for Matt Skura, who went on to play for the Giants and only allowed 2 sacks on 769 snaps, but that's not where his real presence or impact was felt. He came to Miami hoping to win the starting center job, but he did have issues communicating with the rest of the offensive line, which is so important for a center, as well as snapping the ball. So when the Giants picked him up, they moved him to left guard because other than those issues, he's pretty solid. And they moved him right beside Andrew Thomas, who really started to develop and find his way after getting Matt Skura. I'm not trying to say Matt Skura was a major factor in the development of Andrew Thomas, I would never say that, but he definitely played some role with that development. Back to Liam Eichenberg, the Notre Dame offensive lineman was drafted in the 2021 NFL Draft at pick number 42 in the 2nd round.
The 42nd pick in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Miami Dolphins select Liam Eichenberg, tackle, Notre Dame.
He's 6'5", 300, was shorter and, to be honest, at the NFL level, T-Rex arms, but did come into the draft looking like this NFL-ready tackle. He was actually promoted coming out of the draft as some high-floor, low-ceiling type NFL-ready player, where he would come in and already be where he would be for the rest of his career, which should have been pretty good, and then he would never have gone to some all-pro type of level, but he would always been pretty good from the beginning right to the end of his career. He played with and learned from Ronnie Stanley and Quentin Nelson, who are both elite at their position, and in college he was better in the run than in the pass, but contrary to all the guys in the 2020 draft, his thing was that he was very, very good with his technique. He's a strong, smart player who has feel for the position, but he really struggles with his kick slides, which are too slow, very slow for the NFL level, which was exposed, and would rather reach for the opposing defender instead of being patient and letting the defender come to him. Not to mention his short arms does inhibit him from recovering from these type of mistakes that would be major at the NFL level, which could go under the radar at the college level. With that being said, another issue that plagued this Miami Dolphins offensive line during training camp and during the season was the movement of players, which outside of Robert Hunt really negatively impacted them. Jackson played his entire rookie year at the left tackle position and then was suddenly moved to left guard. Eichenberg, who played the majority of his snaps at the left tackle position at Notre Dame, was moved to left guard during training camp, but then once the regular season had already began, was moved back to left tackle, so he was just being moved back and forth. So they were both negatively impacted from being moved around, which probably shouldn't have been the case, and the only reason why Robert Hunt is different is because he actually started in the worst position and then came back into the right position. While he can play right tackle and was actually pretty solid at that right tackle position, position just because he's a good player. He can be elite and has the potential to be a Pro Bowl at the right guard position. So clearly after seeing this year, he is a guard, and it was more out of necessity and poor roster building that he had to start right tackle in that rookie year. At center, I can't really name a specific person just because it was a revolving door at that position. And that definitely didn't help a young quarterback when it's so important for them to be on the same page when it comes to communication with the offensive line and between him and the quarterback. So because of it being a revolving door, it's not even worth talking about anyone at that position just because it changed so much. I would talk about Michael Deiter, but he didn't even play 50% of the snaps, so it really was not worth talking about. So we just had Greg Manx, Austin Reiter, and Michael Deiter kind of rotating at that center position. And then rounding out the offensive line was Jesse Davis at right tackle. He was the answer for Tua's blind side. Tua is obviously left-handed, so his blind side is that right side and that right tackle position, and Jesse Davis was their answer, which was truly awful. And that makes sense because he was never good, so I have no idea why he was ever the answer for the team at that position. Over the course of the year, the offensive line got worse under coach Lemuel Jean-Pierre. For young players, and I know that progression is obviously and evidently not linear, but in general from year to year, I do expect young players to generally get better and to improve, but that's just not what happened. There was no development or progression, and to be honest, I would argue there was regression, which was crazy because Austin Jackson was already bad in his rookie year, but I thought he looked better then than he did in this past year. Eichenberg, who was thought to be this NFL ready and NFL caliber type offensive lineman and left tackle, was easily the worst left tackle, at least starting in the NFL. And God knows why Jesse Davis was starting at right tackle for the entirety of that season. The offensive line went from bottom 5 or 3 or whatever you want to call it to bottom 1, and that was by far. It was the 32nd ranked offensive line, and not just a normal 32nd ranked offensive line, it was an historically bad offensive line. Like legitimately one of the worst 32nd ranked offensive lines in recent history. Liam Eichenberg, Austin Jackson, and Jesse Davis were all top 8 in pressures allowed for offensive linemen, and as a team they allowed 40 more pressures than the team in second place. Tua Tagovailoa had the least amount of time to get the ball out of all teams, and the offensive line still struggled when Tua did get the ball out the fastest out of all NFL teams. And with Tua getting the ball out in 2.1 seconds, the offensive line still struggled. So imagine if Tua wasn't getting the ball out as quickly as he did. Austin Jackson, who accounted for just 2 sacks, which to me is preposterous. I know he's impacted at least more plays that he was at fault for a sack, but either way, he only allowed 2 sacks, but he did allow 12 penalties, which was top 5 for his position. Liam Eichenberg allowed 9 sacks and had 10 penalties, which is just disgusting. And Jesse Davis allowed 8 sacks himself. Keep in mind that we ran an RPO offense, which is designed to get the ball out quickly. Whether it's a handoff or a quick throw, it's a play that's designed to get the ball out quickly, and it was an attempt to hide this atrocious offensive line, but it was still the worst offensive line in the league by far. As a team, we finished dead last in pass block win rate at just 47% per ESPN. There's so much I feel like I could get into, but for now all you need to know is that this was an historically bad 32nd ranked offensive line, and an offensive line with a bunch of young players somehow regressed after a year of having NFL experience. Finally and thankfully we get to this season where Brian Flores was no longer the head coach of the Miami Dolphins and we brought in Mike McDaniel, where it seems that he has finally addressed this offensive line position, and it seems that we should be around top 20, at least somewhere in that range. To be honest, it doesn't sound that great just being top 20, but when we're fully healthy, if we can get a top 20 offensive line, that would easily be the best performing offensive line that Tua Tagovailoa has had in his professional career. Before we get into any new additions to this offensive line, I do want to go over the coaching and the new scheme and system, so we can talk about how that can help the younger players, which we have already talked about so extensively. So after hiring Mike McDaniel, who himself has worked closely with offensive lines, he also essentially hired 4 or 5 new offensive line coaches to help this position group. They all have different roles here because they all can't be offensive line coaches, but they do have different roles now that they're on the team. But on their past teams, they did have some role with their offensive line. With a new coach in Mike McDaniel, like I already mentioned, he is implementing a new system and scheme for the offense and the offensive line, which is a wide zone run scheme. Our new offensive coordinator is Frank Smith from the Los Angeles Chargers, and he was their offensive line coach last year, and he was there to help turn around their offensive line when they were bottom 5 ranked in 2020 into what they are now with guys like Rashawn Slater and Corey Linsley. Matt Filer was a nice addition as well. We also hired Matt Applebaum as our new offensive line coach for Lemuel Jean-Pierre, and he was a coach at Boston College who really thrived at his position, helping guys on his offensive line get drafted in the first round like Zion Johnson. So those are the 2 most notable additions to the offensive line coaching with Frank Smith and Matt Applebaum. and it's a major improvement from the offensive line coaching staffs which we've had in the past. Those two and the rest of the offensive line coaching staff all have experience in developing younger guys into what they can become, which can be so helpful for our young players like Austin Jackson and Liam Eichenberg who need the help. I think that part of those young players struggling was being surrounded by poor coaching, poor players, and poor development. And bringing in this new and improved coaching staff for this offensive line, I do think there's a chance that he can turn those two players, Austin Jackson and Liam Eichenberg, into usable NFL starters if developed correctly. I actually have two different reasons for each player in Liam Eichenberg and Austin Jackson respectively of why this new system, scheme, and coaching can help them become those usable NFL starters. So for me, Liam Eichenberg can be helped tremendously with this new coaching staff, and the reason that I think he can become a usable NFL starter is because of obviously how he's touted as this NFL ready player out of the draft, as he was only exposed to poor coaching for this Miami Dolphins team for just that last year, which was his rookie year. So I'm really hoping that with this new coaching staff, they can put in the right habits and traits into his game to make him that usable and NFL ready caliber player that we saw at Notre Dame. So I'm really excited to see what Mike McDaniel and Frank Smith and the rest of the coaching staff can do with Liam Eichenberg and to see what they can get out of him. While I don't love him at guard, which is his expected position for this upcoming season, I don't love that fit because of his anchor and his base, or I should say his lack of anchor and his lack of base. But with this new coaching and new scheme, I think he can come back way stronger than he looked last year. Austin Jackson should also improve with this new staff in place. He has all the physical traits that this scheme requires to be great, and he fits this new wide zone scheme to a T with his athleticism. It's just a question of if his technique can catch up, which to be honest with this new coaching, I do think there's a possibility of that. Is it very, very likely? Maybe not, but I do think it's possible. He's also expected to move to right tackle for this upcoming season, at least that's his expected position, which will have its challenges and its changes because he will be kicking off his opposite foot and will be kicking in the opposite direction. But to be completely honest, with his lack of technique in the first place, it shouldn't be too much of a transition to that right tackle position, where it can't be worse than it was on the left side. So he can learn the proper techniques on a new, fresh side of the football and learn legitimately good habits from this new coaching. Robert Hunt will stay at right guard, which makes sense as he thrived at that position even when surrounded by horrible talent, and he's continued to impress. So imagine what he can do with new and better players around him with that improved coaching. So I'm very excited to see what he can do this year. Kellen Diesch was added as a undrafted free agent right after the draft and is worth noting because he should be in competition for that swing tackle position. And to be honest, I was pretty surprised that he wasn't drafted, so it was a very nice pickup in that UDFA market. So that was a nice pickup for some depth instead of using a guy like Adam Pankey or Greg Little. You're probably wondering what happened to Solomon Kindley, as he's kind of disappeared from this video after that 2020 season, and the reason that his name has disappeared from the video is that he disappeared after 2020. It's rumored, and I'm pretty sure it might have been confirmed, but I don't want to confirm it if it's not, that he gained a bunch of weight, which was already an issue before gaining that weight, which is why he suddenly disappeared. So I can definitely see him being a cut candidate when we get to training camp this year. And under Mike McDaniel, as I said before when I was talking about him coming out of college, he's not really a wide zone type player. He's more of a power gap type player for that scheme, so he definitely doesn't fit the Mike McDaniel type offense. He's a little bit overweight, so it kind of just looks like he's a cut candidate going forward. So that's kind of unfortunate for a guy who I thought showed some promise to be something in the NFL, to at least stay on the roster, but it looks like he could be moving on. Michael Deiter has been disappointing, to be blunt. He's been injured and he's just been bad. He was drafted back in 2019 in the 3rd round and just really hasn't impressed. Maybe bad is an overstatement, but I do think he hasn't been great and he hasn't been good. He's definitely a below average center. As of right now and thus far in camp, he struggled so much that they've essentially forced Mike McDaniel and the Miami Dolphins to play Connor Williams at center, which they would have liked to have played at left guard. It's unfortunate. He should be a solid backup going forward, but that's all really to be expected out of this player unless he shows me something different under this new coaching staff. Keon Smith, Cole Banwart, and Blaise Andries are all guys who are on the team and were acquired in all sorts of ways, but I don't think they're even worth mentioning because I don't see them making the 53-man roster. And the last player I haven't mentioned is Robert Jones, who did actually make the roster last year, but that was under that power gap scheme. And with Mike McDaniel, I don't know. I doubt he makes the 53-man roster, but I do want to separate him from those other three because with him being on the roster last year, there's always a chance he makes it again this year. So he's a fringe player and could be a solid backup, but to me, he's not a seamless scheme fit for this Mike McDaniel system. And now, finally, we get to the two new additions that should finally help this offensive line prosper: Connor Williams and Terron Armstead. We'll start with Connor Williams because he's such an interesting signing, not because of what you might think, but like I said earlier, because of the expected position for him to play going forward. The signing itself is actually very tidy work from Chris Grier, as it's 2 years worth $14 million for a player who only allowed 1 sack last year. I'm well aware, and I know a lot of people mention how he did allow a lot of penalties this year, but if you look at the rest of his career, that's clearly an outlier, as he allowed more penalties last year than he did for the rest of his career combined. So as long as he regresses back to the mean in terms of penalties and his production stays the same, we could have a Pro Bowler left guard and or center on our hands. The most interesting piece of this signing is that he is reportedly going to play center for this team, as he has in the past in preseason games and in practice. And I guess for this team, this makes the most sense because I guess you get to have Liam Eichenberg starting on that offensive line at left guard with moving Connor Williams to center. While I don't disagree completely with the move of moving Connor Williams to the center position, and I'm obviously not smarter than Mike McDaniel or the Dolphins brass, so that's not what I'm claiming here. It just is a little bit off-putting when you know how good Connor Williams can be at left guard. But to me, I do think it will be helpful as training camp is coming up. I do think it will be helpful to bring in another interior offensive lineman to this team. And this is regardless if they play left guard or center. If he plays center, great, you can move Connor Williams back to left guard. But if he plays guard, you can move him at guard and keep Connor Williams at center. The reason I think it's a good idea to bring in another piece is just because it gives that added protection in case Liam Eichenberg isn't ready to take on that left guard spot yet. The same thing could be said for the tackle position if Austin Jackson doesn't take the jump or Terron Armstead does get injured. So it'll be very interesting to see if Miami does decide to add another offensive line during training camp. But with that being said, let's get to the big fish, Terron Armstead. Terron Armstead was acquired via free agency, signing a 5-year $75 million deal worth $15 million on average per year, which is honestly way less than I expected for a top 3 left tackle in the game when healthy. It's an incredible signing that was so necessary and will provide so many rewards on and off the field, as he is surrounded by a bunch of young players, so his ability to mentor them is a huge factor of why the Miami Dolphins signed him, and a huge factor of why he can be such a big help for this team, regardless of if it's on the field production, which we'll obviously get as he is a top 3 left tackle in the game, but he can definitely help with that off the field mentoring. He can help coach up these players and coach up these guys, and that's a huge step up from Jesse Davis to Terron Armstead being your veteran. And if you are around in the Dolphins community, you've probably already seen that Terron Armstead is already making the rounds to help making his young teammates better. He's a great veteran in the locker room and is a fantastic and seamless scheme fit with this Mike McDaniel wide zone run scheme. It's genuinely a perfect match. He literally holds the fastest 40-yard dash time for an offensive lineman and has been in a similar scheme in New Orleans under Sean Payton, where you can see him thrive in space, where you can see him using his power and athleticism in both the run and pass game. There's literally only one thing holding him back from being further up the rung for those left tackles, which is his health. He hasn't been able to stay healthy, which to be fair is a major factor, but when he is healthy, he's a top 3 left tackle in football. Overall, I think it's an intriguing offensive line, especially with the move of Connor Williams to center, but it will be easily the best offensive line that Tua has had thus far. I am a little worried that we are one injury away to Terron Armstead, who is injury prone, that we could be going back to that 2021 offensive line. But I will say, even with an injury to Terron Armstead, the improved coaching and improved development with this new coaching staff should provide value so that all the other guys do get better surrounding Terron Armstead. I have confidence that this new coaching staff can develop these guys into the best players they have been at this level, which to be fair, based on their pass production, can't be too hard. So with that being said, I should give you a look of the entire offensive line, which should go like this if healthy, which is left tackle Terron Armstead, left guard Liam Eichenberg, center Connor Williams, right guard Robert Hunt, and right tackle Austin Jackson, which should be around that top 20 range, especially with the additions of Connor Williams and Terron Armstead, especially already having Robert Hunt, so that is nice to see. So that's how I see this position group of the offensive line turning out based on my own analysis and evaluation, and based on reports that we've seen in camp this far. So let's see what this offensive line will look like heading into this year's regular season. With all of that being said, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.